in the shadowed corridors of the British Admiralty, a desperate and secret race against time was underway. It was the early years of the Second World War, and the North Atlantic had become a graveyard for Allied shipping. Beneath the freezing grey swells, the Nazi U-boat fleet operated with impunity, cutting the vital arteries of supply that kept Britain alive. To combat this invisible menace, a clandestine research endeavour was authorised, a project that would eventually birth a weapon capable of rewriting the rules of maritime warfare. For decades, the standard response to a submerged enemy was the depth charge. This was a weapon of brute force. Massive canisters rolled off the stern of a destroyer, set to explode at a specific depth. The theory relied on hydrostatic shockwaves to crush the submarine's hull. However, in practice, it was a flawed method. To deploy depth charges, a ship had to pass directly over the target, forcing the sonar operators to lose contact at the most critical moment. It was, effectively, a game of blind man's bluff played with high explosives. The Admiralty realized that to win the war at sea, they didn't just need a bigger bomb. They needed a fundamental shift in geometry. They needed a weapon that looked forward, not backward. The concept was radical but necessary. Design a device capable of firing spigot mortars ahead of the attacking ship, allowing the vessel to maintain sonar contact right up until the moment of impact. The initial attempt to realize this vision was the Fairley mortar. While the Fairley was an ambitious step forward, it was ultimately a failure, plagued by design flaws and inconsistent results. Yet, in the high-stakes theatre of war, failure is often the harsh tuition paid for a breakthrough. From the lessons learned in the Fairley misadventure, a new, more lethal design began to take shape. It was a strange-looking apparatus consisting of rows of fixed launcher spigots angled toward the sky. When the device was empty, devoid of its lethal payloads, these rows of jagged metal spikes bore an uncanny resemblance to the spines of a defensive animal. And so it was christened the Hedgehog. Unlike the depth charge, the Hedgehog did not rely on near misses or shock waves. It was a contact weapon. It would rain down in a circular pattern ahead of the ship, sinking silently through the water, detonating only if it struck the hard steel of a U-boat's hull. This innovation would eventually redeem the failures of the past and become one of the most feared sights for German submariners. To understand the gravity of this invention, one must look at the state of the war when the project began. Following the outbreak of World War II, the German U-boat arm, the U-Bootwaffe, had rapidly evolved from a nuisance into an existential threat for the Allied fleet. The Atlantic was no longer safe, it was a hunting ground, and the Allies were losing. The British Admiralty recognized that standard naval tactics were failing. To balance the scales against the U-boat menace, they turned to a group that operated outside the rigid traditions of the Royal Navy. This top-secret initiative was placed in the hands of the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, or the DMWD. Hidden away from the public eye, this department was a collection of scientists, engineers, and creative thinkers who were often referred to affectionately and sometimes skeptically as the Wheezers and Dodgers. Their mandate was simple yet daunting: invent weapons that didn't exist for problems that seemed unsolvable. Their specific goal in this instance was to engineer a delivery system far more lethal and precise than the clumsy, broad-area attacks of conventional depth charges. As noted, the path to success was paved with failure. The 1941 trials of the Fairley mortar were disappointing, failing to produce a reliable weapon. However, in the world of experimental warfare, a dead end is often just a detour. The DMWD sifted through the wreckage of the Fairley project and found the seeds of a revolution. They realized that the solution lay not in traditional naval gunnery, but in a concept borrowed from the infantry. The breakthrough came from the mind of Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a man known for his eccentricity and his obsession with infantry trench mortars. Blacker had pioneered a technology known as the spigot discharger. Unlike a traditional cannon or mortar, which fires a shell out of a hollow tube, Blacker's design inverted the concept entirely. To understand the genius of the upcoming Hedgehog, one must understand the mechanics of Blacker's spigot. Imagine a solid steel rod, the spigot fixed to a heavy base plate. The projectile was not loaded inside a barrel. Instead, it was fitted with a hollow tubular tail that slid over the steel rod. The propelling charge was located inside the tail of the bomb itself. When the trigger was pulled, the charge would detonate against the top of the rod, launching the heavy warhead into the air. This design allowed for a relatively small, lightweight launcher to fire massive projectiles, as there was no heavy barrel to contain the explosion. This unique mechanism had already seen action on land. It was the driving force behind the Blacker Bombard, a 29mm spigot mortar, and would later achieve fame in the hands of British infantry as the Piat Projector infantry anti-tank weapon. While Blacker provided the mechanical heart of the invention, it took a partnership to bring it to the sea. The principle caught the eye of Major Millis Jefferies, the head of military intelligence research. Jefferies was a visionary who specialized in unconventional warfare. He had already worked with Blacker to bring the spigot design to the army, but he saw a greater potential. He realized that if he took Blacker's spigot concept, which could fire heavy explosives without the recoil of a massive gun, and arranged it in a cluster, you could create a shotgun effect for naval vessels. Thus, a collaboration began that would transplant the heart of an anti-tank weapon into the hull of a destroyer, setting the stage for the Hedgehog's true inception. The resulting weapon was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. When the order to fire was given, the Hedgehog did not release a solitary projectile. It unleashed a swarm. The device was capable of firing a devastating salvo of 24 small bombs in a rapid-fire ripple effect, hurling them directly over the bow of the ship. This was not random fire. It was a calculated cage of explosives. The trajectory of the bombs was governed by a precise mathematical arch projection. The goal was to blanket a specific patch of the ocean, creating a circular or elliptical kill zone approximately 100 feet in diameter at a range of 250 yards. By saturating this area, the Royal Navy drastically increased the statistical probability of a hit compared to the single-point drops of the past. However, the Atlantic Ocean is rarely a flat, stable platform. In the early iterations, the weapon's mounting was fixed to the deck. This meant that if the destroyer pitched or rolled in heavy seas, as they often did, the aim of the mortar would swing wildly off target. To counter the unpredictable nature of the ocean, the design was upgraded with a gyro-stabilized base. This crucial innovation allowed the launcher to compensate for the ship's movement, keeping the spigots locked on the horizon and allowing the attacking ship to maneuver freely without sacrificing accuracy. The projectiles themselves were compact instruments of ruin. Each individual mortar shell measured 7.1 inches in diameter and weighed a total of 65 pounds. Inside this steel casing lay the true danger, a 35-pound core of Torpex. Torpex was a specialized explosive, roughly 50% more powerful than TNT, specifically designed to shatter the pressure hulls of submarines. The launcher's spigots were angled with mathematical precision to ensure the perfect spread. When the salvo landed, it covered a discharge diameter of 130 feet, striking the water roughly 590 feet ahead of the ship. This forward-throwing capability was the Hedgehog's greatest tactical advantage, but the terror truly began once the bombs broke the surface. Unlike depth charges, which drifted slowly, the Hedgehog projectiles were streamlined for speed. They sliced through the dark waters, sinking at a rate of 33 feet per second. This rapid descent meant there was no time for evasive maneuvers. A salvo could reach a U-boat lurking at a depth of 200 feet in under 9 seconds. The most revolutionary aspect of the Hedgehog, however, was its silence. Standard depth charges were set to detonate at a specific depth, creating massive hydrostatic shockwaves. These explosions shook the ocean, deafened sonar operators, and churned the water, blinding the hunting ship. The Hedgehog was different. It was a contact weapon. It would fall in absolute silence, detonating only if a fuse physically struck the hard steel surface of a U-boat. This binary nature hit or mischanged the psychology of the hunt. If a Hedgehog charge exploded, the crew on the surface knew instantly that they had scored a direct hit. There was no guesswork, only the immediate, catastrophic rupture of the enemy hull. Fitted prominently at the bow of Allied ships, this impressive device sharpened the accuracy of anti-submarine warfare to a razor's edge, forcing the Nazi Kriegsmarine to scramble for new innovations to survive the rain of steel. The genius of the Hedgehog's design lay not just in the explosives it delivered, but in the elegance of its firing mechanism. The weapon consisted of 4 separate cradles, each cradling 6 projectiles. When the order was given to fire, the system did not discharge all 24 mortars in a single violent explosion. Instead, they fired in a rapid, synchronized ripple sequence. This ripple fire was a masterstroke of engineering. It ensured that while the bombs left the spigots one after another, their varying angles and charges meant they would all splash down into the water simultaneously, creating a uniform net of destruction. Crucially, this staggered firing sequence meant the weapon's mounting did not subject the ship to excessive recoil stress. The kick was distributed over seconds rather than milliseconds. As a result, the the Admiralty did not need to reinforce the decks of their ships with heavy steel plating. The Hedgehog could be smoothly retrofitted onto almost any vessel, from heavy destroyers to smaller corvettes and converted merchant escorts, turning the entire fleet into potential U-boat killers. Furthermore, the weapon was designed for the frantic pace of combat. A well-drilled crew could swarm the empty cradles and reload the entire array in under 3 minutes, allowing the ship to circle back and unleash a second volley before the enemy could recover. However, the most significant contribution of the Hedgehog was how it solved the fatal flaw of early anti-submarine warfare, the blind spot. To understand this problem, one must step into the shoes of a sonar operator in 1941. When using traditional depth charges, a hunter ship had to steam directly over the submerged U-boat to drop explosives off the stern. But as the ship closed in on the target, the physics of sound became an enemy. Aztec early sonar relied on sending out a sound pulse and listening for the echo. When the distance between the hunter and the hunted shrank below the technology's minimum range, the time it took for the sound to travel to the sub and bounce back became infinitesimal. Eventually, the returning echo arrived so quickly that it merged with the outgoing pulse. This phenomenon, known as the instantaneous echo, created a chaotic wall of noise in the operator's headset. The human ear simply couldn't distinguish the target anymore. Just as the destroyer moved in for the kill, the submarine would vanish from the sensors. This created a terrifying blind spot, a window of silence where the U-boat was invisible. In those crucial moments, a savvy German captain could execute a hard turn or a deep dive, slipping away while the depth charges exploded harmlessly in the empty water behind him. The Hedgehog changed the geometry of the fight. Because it was a four-mounted weapon that discharged projectiles over the bow, the attack could be launched while the enemy was still hundreds of yards ahead, firmly locked in the sonar beam. The operator never lost contact. They could track the U-boat right up until the moment of impact. By eliminating the blind spot, the Hedgehog stripped away the U-boat's last line of defense, giving Allied commanders in the Atlantic and Pacific a tangible, lethal advantage. Despite its geometric elegance, the Hedgehog was not without its limitations. It was a weapon of medium depth. Once a target dove below 400 feet, the mortar's effectiveness dropped precipitously. At those crushing depths, the time required for the bombs to sink allowed the submarine too much time to drift out of the calculated kill zone. However, this limitation was offset by the sheer violence of a successful strike. While a depth charge might need to explode within feet of a hull to cause a rupture, the Hedgehog's contact-fused warheads were unforgiving. A single direct hit was often enough to trigger a cataclysmic chain reaction, detonating the U-boat's own torpedo stores or fuel tanks. One or two strikes didn't just damage a submarine, they annihilated it. A crisis of confidence. When the Hedgehog officially entered service in 1942, installed on roughly 100 escort ships, the Admiralty expected an immediate turning of the tide. Instead, they were met with underwhelming statistics. In the harsh reality of combat, the initial success rate hovered at a dismal 5%, barely an improvement over the despised depth charges. The problem was environmental as much as it was mechanical. The North Atlantic is a brutal theater of war, characterized by freezing gales and massive swells. Mounted on the exposed forecastle of the ship, the Hedgehog launchers were constantly battered by corrosive salt spray and waves crashing over the bow. This exposure wreaked havoc on the sensitive electrical firing circuits. All too often, a captain would maneuver his ship into the perfect firing position, press the trigger, and be met with a ragged, incomplete volley or worse, silence. This unreliability bred deep resentment among the crews. Sailors are creatures of habit who trust what they can hear and feel. Even a missed depth charge attack produced a massive, morale-boosting explosion that felt like they were fighting back. A missed Hedgehog attack was simply a silent splash in the water. The lack of an explosion, unless a hit was scored, left crews feeling impotent, leading to a widespread lack of confidence in the device. It became the ugly duckling of the deck, often ignored in favor of traditional methods. The Admiralty intervenes. By early 1943, the situation had become critical. The Royal Navy realized that the weapon was being deployed so intermittently that they took a drastic administrative step. Captains were ordered to submit a written report explaining exactly why they had failed to use the Hedgehog during any contact with a submarine. This forced accountability, combined with a rigorous overhaul of training protocols, shifted the paradigm. As crews were taught to trust the mathematics rather than their instincts, and as maintenance routines improved to protect the circuitry from the weather, the metrics began to climb. The transformation was staggering. By the war's end, data concluded that 1 in every 5 hedgehog attacks resulted in a confirmed kill. In stark contrast, it took 80 depth charge attacks to achieve the same result. The silent killer had finally found its voice. The enemy adapts. The weapon became so effective that it forced a technological evolution within the Kriegsmarine. In 1943, realizing that their U-boats were vulnerable to surface attacks, the Germans implemented the acoustic torpedo program, the G7E's Zonkönig. These homing torpedoes allowed German commanders to fire at convoy escorts from greater distances without ever raising a periscope, aiming to destroy the hunters before they could get within hedgehog range. The legend of the US England. While the Atlantic saw the hedgehog's baptism by fire, the Pacific would witness its ultimate mastery. By mid-1944, the focus shifted to a specific vessel that would carve its name into naval history, the US England. The US England De-635 was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, a type of ship designed for utility rather than glory. Named in honor of Ensign John C. England, a hero who died saving his crewmates during the attack on Pearl Harbor, the ship was part of a class intended to be a cheaper, smaller alternative to the massive fleet destroyers. These vessels were the workhorses of the Navy, tasked with the unglamorous, grueling duty of shepherding slow merchant convoys across the vast, lonely stretches of the world's oceans. They were never meant to be the spearhead of an offensive until the crew of the England proved otherwise. On paper, the US England was an unassuming vessel, hardly the type of ship one would expect to become a legend. Displacing a mere 1,400 tons and manned by a crew of 186 mostly reservist sailors, she was a lightweight compared to the fleet's heavy hitters. When placed alongside a standard Fletcher-class destroyer, the England appeared woefully undergunned. She carried 3 3-inch guns, effectively pea shooters compared to the heavy 5-inch batteries of her larger cousins. Her anti-aircraft defense was lighter, boasting only 12 guns instead of 20, and she carried a meager 3 torpedoes compared to the standard 10. She was designed for defense, not aggression. Yet she possessed an equalizer. Sitting ominously on her foredeck was the Hedgehog. This weapon transformed the humble escort into a lethal predator, provided the crew had the nerve to use it. The first kill, a duel of wits. The England's rendezvous with destiny began on May 18, 1944. Along with 2 other destroyer escorts, she was ordered to intercept a Japanese submarine reported to be moving toward the Solomon Islands to resupply isolated garrisons. The following afternoon, the ping of the sonar room shattered the calm. They had a solid contact. It was the I-16, a massive Japanese cargo-carrying submarine. What followed was not a simple execution, but a deadly dance between 2 skilled crews. Captain John Williamson, the England's executive officer, watched from the bridge as the ship began her attack runs. But the Japanese commander was a veteran. He knew the blind spots of American sonar. For 4 agonizing attempts, the England tried to bring her Hedgehog to bear. Each time, just as the destroyer committed to her approach, the I-16 would execute a sharp, cunning turn, matching the attacker's course and slipping out of the firing solution. It was a frustrating game of cat and mouse, with the submarine hiding in the destroyer's own wake. However, on the 5th run, the England anticipated the move. The crew adjusted, the ship swung, and the Hedgehog fired its ripple of mortars. Silence hung over the ocean for seconds. Then the sea erupted. 4 to 6 violent detonations rocked the depths. The force of the underwater blasts was so immense that the England, floating nearly directly above, was physically heaved upward. The stern of the 400-ton steel vessel was lifted 6 inches out of the water before plopping heavily back down into the churning foam. The crew's tension broke into roaring delight as debris and oil slicked the surface. As Williamson later recalled with grim satisfaction, we had, with cataclysmic certainty, heard the last of one Japanese submarine. Operation Ago. The trap turned inside out. The destruction of the I-16 was merely the prelude. Later that month, the Imperial Japanese Navy initiated Operation Ago. This was a high-stakes gamble, a plan for a decisive battle intended to crush the American fleet and reverse the war's momentum. As part of this grand strategy, the Japanese command established a defensive picket line. 7 advanced submarines were ordered to take up stationary positions northeast of New Guinea. The logic was sound. This line would act as a tripwire, intercepting the American fleet as they moved north, sinking key vessels, and providing early warning for the main Japanese force. It was intended to be a wall of steel and torpedoes. However, the Japanese were unaware of a fatal flaw in their security. American intelligence had already cracked their naval codes. The wall was not a secret, it was a known coordinate on an American map. Rather than sailing blindly into the ambush, the US Navy decided to dismantle the trap from the inside out. They didn't send a massive fleet, they sent the US England and her 2 companions. Armed with the precise locations of the enemy and the lethal efficiency of the Hedgehog, the hunters steamed toward the Japanese line, ready to smash the submarines one by one. Here is the rewritten and significantly expanded version of the final part. I have turned the sequence of sinkings into a narrative crescendo, emphasizing the crew's exhaustion and adrenaline. I also expanded the dramatic dialogue during the final hunt to highlight the tension between the ships, making the England's ultimate victory feel like the climax of a movie. Part 7. The 12 Days of Ruin. The legend of the US England truly began in the dark hours of May 22nd. The destroyer escort George sliced through the black water, her lookout straining against the night. Suddenly, a shape broke the surface. It was the Japanese submarine Row 106, cruising unknowingly on the surface to recharge her batteries. The George immediately swung her searchlights, bathing the enemy conning tower in a blinding artificial noon. Panic erupted on the Japanese vessel as she crash-dived, desperate to reach the safety of the deep before the shells began to fly. But the Row 106 could not escape the net. While the George had spotted her, it was the England that moved in for the kill. Steaming into position with practiced calm, she unleashed a lethal barrage of hedgehogs. The wait was agonizingly short. 3 distinct, muffled crunches echoed through the hull of the American ship. Seconds later, the ocean burped a massive bubble of air and oil to the surface, followed by the gruesome debris of a shattered vessel. The Row 106 was gone. The rhythm of destruction. A strange momentum took hold of the crew. They were no longer just sailors, they were a machine. Over the next 48 hours, the England operated with terrifying efficiency. On May 23rd, she tracked and obliterated the Row 104. The very next day, she claimed the Row 116. The ocean, usually so vast and empty, seemed to be offering up targets to the England's sonar operators. By May 26th, a specialized hunter-killer task force arrived to relieve the exhausted destroyer escorts. The England, along with her sister ships George and Raby, was ordered to head to the island of Manus for much-needed fuel and ammunition. They were effectively being benched, sent to the rear while the fresh ships took over. But fate was not finished with them. En route to the supply base, the England's sonar pinged again. It was the Row 108. Even while retreating from the front lines, the ship was a magnet for the enemy. With a single, precise engagement, the England destroyed her 4th submarine in a week. The final stand of Row 105. After a brief resupply, the England and her companions steamed back toward the Japanese picket line to finish the job. On the morning of May 30th, the destroyer Hazelwood spotted the Row 105. This was a veteran Japanese crew, and they were not going down without a fight. The hunt was chaotic. Several American ships, including the George and the Raby, swarmed the area, determined to claim a kill for themselves. The England, having already hogged the glory, was explicitly ordered to stay back and hold her fire. For an entire day, the other ships chased the elusive sub, dropping depth charges and maneuvering wildly, but the Row 105 evaded every blow. As the sun began to set on a day of frustration, Captain Williamson of the England radioed an offer to assist. The reply from the lead ship was curt, dripping with professional pride and irritation. "We are not going to tell you where we are. We have a damaged sub, and we are going to sink her. Do not come near us." The situation took a bizarre turn when the Row 105, perhaps sensing the confusion above, surfaced directly between the 2 hunting destroyer escorts. By positioning herself there, the Japanese captain ensured that if the Americans opened fire with their guns, they would hit each other. It was a brilliant tactical stalemate. Division Commander Haynes, realizing his other ships had been outplayed and outmaneuvered, swallowed his pride. He keyed his radio and spoke the words that sealed the submarine's fate. "Oh hell. Go ahead, England." Like an unleashed hound, the England surged forward. She didn't use her guns. She used the weapon she had mastered. She fired a devastating hedgehog ripple. The result was overkill. Between 6 and 10 projectiles struck the submarine simultaneously. The explosion was so violent that it practically disintegrated the Row 105 underwater, sending a massive plume of oil and wreckage erupting to the surface. The hunt was over. A legacy unmatched. To this day, the US England holds a record that has never been broken in the history of naval warfare. 6 enemy submarines destroyed by a single ship in just 12 days. The strategic impact was immense. The Japanese had lined up 7 submarines to ambush the American fleet. With the help of the Hedgehog, the England and her group had wiped out 5 of them. They had blinded the Imperial Navy right before the decisive battles of the Pacific, foretelling the inevitable end of the war. The spiny monster that had been mocked by crews in the Atlantic had proven itself to be the ultimate predator. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into naval history. The story of the Hedgehog proves that sometimes the strangest innovations are the ones that change the world. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, it truly helps the channel. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the Hedgehog was the best anti-submarine weapon of the war, or does that title belong to something else?